think sometimes my computer can't decide if it's going to log me in as a deed person or as the person who set up the meeting on their MAPE calendar. And I think that's why it's not letting me record. It's frustrating.
Sorry.
Okay. But yeah, we can post it. And that way, if people wanted to come and couldn't make it, they'll have that chance.
Sounds good. And then I'll wait for you to kick us off there, Maureen.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We've had some requests due to the layoffs that have already been happening to talk about what the role of meet and confer is in layoffs. And it's actually a fairly important one because the employer we're usually who gets notified if there's going to be a layoff, but also we're the ones that they negotiate with usually if there's, along with our BA, of course, if there's going to be any efforts taken to mitigate layoff, like early retirement incentives and things like that. So, and they have to come to that memorandum of understanding. And we're usually the ones talking about like what's going to happen to the member. So I'll kick it off to Nick and he'll go through like some of the basics and, where that comes into like the articles of the contract and all of that. And then I'll talk about some of the experiences we've been having.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks, Maureen. Thanks everybody for I know there's some names I don't recognize. My name's Nick Fry. I'm a business agent on staff with MAPE. I'm the staff liaison to the Meet Confer Chairs Committee. So I'm going to facilitate a discussion about the Meet Confer process and how it relates to Article 17, which is layoff and recall. I'm going to use a PowerPoint that some of my colleagues put together, and some of you may have seen this. This was rolled out to the board of directors, to the ERC. Some steward teams are getting it. I did add one slide that's unique to us, but otherwise this is the pretty standard Article 17 training. I'm just going to use it just to guide our conversation to make sure that I don't accidentally miss something. But I do want this to be more of an open discussion because I feel like you all have stuff to learn that I can learn from and that we can all learn from each other. So please, as I'm going through this, please at any point, speak up. Feel free to just unmute and blurt out. Totally fine. Share any questions you have, any experiences you want to share, feel free. Again, I'm going to kind of use the PowerPoint as a guide, but it's not meant to be super formal. Okay. So objectives of the day, of course, our main objective is to discuss meet and confer involvement and how meet and confer teams play into our contractual rights regarding the layoff process and in particular Article 17. So we'll also talk about just review some of the key definitions and understandings, just because we really have to have like a grounding as long as we're like, it's hard to understand the layoff. Let me just say on the outset, Article 17 is probably the most confusing article in the contract. So I'm going to cover all the definitions that are listed in that article just to make sure that we're on the same page, even though they may not directly relate to our position on the meet confer teams. We'll talk about what the layoff is, what it's not, some of the pitfalls in the layoff process, and then how it interacts with the other articles of the contract. The big thing to note on this first slide here is that layoff rights, Article 17 is only for classified employees. Now, at the end, if we want to talk about academic unclassifieds in our college campuses, they do have some rights under reduction of force, but it is not the same. They don't have bumping rights. So for our discussion today, we're only going to be focused on classified service. So temporary unclassifieds do not count into this Article 17. LCCMR unclassifieds are not impacted by this article, and then academic unclassifieds are also not. So it's a really important point to say on the outset that only positions in classified service are impacted by Article 17 and what we'll be talking about. Of course, the statewide meet confer engages with agencies around budgetary planning processes. That's why Article 17, Section 2 allows us to have this special involvement with the agency when they are working on layoffs. So this slide says we won't know the details until layoff letters have been issued. Now that's where meet confer teams come in. So this is where meet confer teams can interact with the agencies prior to layoff letters being issued so that we do have some understanding of the impact before they issue layoff letters. So that's an important role for meet and confer committees. Of course, checking seniority rosters is really important for all groups, stewards, rank and file, members, non-members. Everybody should be looking at seniority rosters to make sure that they're accurate. Meet and Confer committee is a good place if we're not getting updated lists. If they're not following that, the Meet and Confer is a good place to bring that to their attention. Also, stewards can do that as well. And just so folks know, no layoff notices have been issued yet, but as folks know, Maureen and Deed have been working on some stuff, so they're getting close. So we'll talk about that. But other than that, this is coming out of the federal funding freeze, but we've not seen huge layoffs just yet from that. Okay, some terminology and definitions. So these first couple bullets are really important in order to understand the layoff process going forward. It's really important to understand these key definitions, the first couple ones. So seniority units, this is really important. They're listed in your contract on page 101 if you have a hard copy of your contract in front of you. So for agencies which are not DOC, DHS, or Minnesota State, seniority units basically means the agency. So those agencies, which are not the ones I mentioned, just have one seniority unit. So when seniority units talked about, they're just basically talking about the agency. So PCA just has one seniority unit. So saying the agency's PCA is the seniority unit is the same thing. Same with admin or commerce, revenue just has one statewide seniority unit. So for those folks, seniority unit just means agency. However, there are some agencies which have multiple seniority units, and that's where it gets a little confusing. So for DOC, for example, they have multiple seniority units for every prison. So Lionel Lakes is one seniority unit. Red Wing is one seniority unit. Shakopee is one seniority unit. Same with college campuses. So colleges have their own seniority units. And some campuses are so spread out, each campus has their own seniority unit because they're like just vast in geography. And then DHS is the other one that has multiple seniority units. There's central office seniority unit, there's a direct care and treatment seniority unit, and then there's one just for forensics in the sex offender program. Does everybody have an understanding of seniority units? Good with that piece? Okay, cool. Because again, that's a really important part when we go through all the options. You'll be hearing this term seniority unit over and over and over. Classification seniority versus state seniority. So when we're talking layoff rights in Article 17, we are talking about classification seniority, not state seniority. So classification seniority is the time that the person has been in that specific classification, so in that position. And that is what impacts like bumping. Seniority around bumping is based on classification seniority. State seniority is the time somebody's been employed with the state. That impacts vacation accruals, your pension, things like that. But for layoff rights and for bumping, it's class seniority is what we want to focus on. So classification and class option. Classification is basically like your position title that's tied to your pay level. So like an ITS2 is a classification or CPT3 is a classification. So that's your classification. It's basically what's tied to your pay level in the back of the contract. And then class option is a classification within a classification. And the best way to illustrate this is to use an example. So I know they're pretty common in the IT series. So there could be like an ITS2 with a web development class option or an ITS2 with a database management class option. So they're like classifications within classifications. Are folks good on that piece? Okay, cool. And again, stop me if I'm going too fast or if you want me to re-clarify anything, totally cool. Layoff letters, those are pretty self-explanatory. So these are anybody who's in a position, regardless of their seniority or whatever, anybody who's in a position that's getting cut will get a layoff letter. And that'll lay out the options that they have or what like their next steps. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Kristen. Like having a major and a minor. I was also thinking it's like those Russian dolls that have like a doll within a doll within a doll. That was the analogy that popped up in my head. Okay, so and then at-risk letters are anybody who potentially could get bumped. Like their specific position is not going to get cut, but they're likely to get bumped because of seniority and how the dominoes fall. Classified service versus unclassified service. We already talked about that at the beginning. Just to reiterate, so Minnesota State does have some rights for unclassified employees who are facing a reduction in force, and that's in their supplemental agreement. Claiming is referring to if there's going to be options for people who are laid off to ask, to request to take a vacancy in another agency. That's considered claiming. Employment condition refers to two components. One, geography within 35 miles. So 35 miles is the geographic standard that we use in our contract for a lot of things, and it'll become clearer as we go through this. And then the other aspect of employment condition is full-time or part-time. So when you see employment condition, that'll pop up. That's referring to the location of the job within 35 miles and whether or not it's part-time or a full-time job. Prior notice to employees, that's pretty self-explanatory. The contract gives us a 21-day notice requirement, which is a minimum. And this is a part where Confer teams can come in and to try to increase that notice period. And then decision days. In the layoff letters, the employees will have a day where they have to make a decision. So as we go through this, you'll see that the employees have a lot of options. So there'll be a specific date that they're given by the employer that they have to choose their option by, and that's decision day. Any questions on the definitions?
Nick, for claiming, that's within the same classification, correct? Still?
Yep. Okay. There'll be two options. There's one list to claim within the same classification, and then there's another to previous lower classifications that the employee previously held.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. We'll move on. Okay. So this is the part that's really relevant to us. So I know this is not good PowerPoint etiquette to put all this many words on a slide, but nonetheless, I thought it was good to have the contract language verbatim in front of us. So this is the contract language that gives us as Meet Confer committees the right to work with management and to have a voice heard with management when it comes to the budgetary layoff process. However, I do want to note on the outset, unfortunately, the decision to lay employees off and the scope of the layoffs, meaning how many positions are impacted, is a management right to determine the size of its workforce. So we really can't, it really would be hard. I'm not saying it's impossible, like good organizing can accomplish a lot of great things. But this language isn't really meant for us to completely stop layoffs. It would be great if it was, but I just want to sort of level set that from the beginning, that generally unions do not have that much leverage when it comes to telling management like the size of their workforce. However, our contract gives us an opportunity to attempt to mitigate the impact of the layoffs through the Meet, Confer, and MOU negotiations process regarding how the layoffs are implemented. So I'm going to turn over to you in a second, Maureen, but for the most part, how we've seen this used is an attempt to increase the notice requirement beyond 21 days. So the academic professionals at Minnesota State, they get 35 days. So that could be a good standard. We could, at least give people an extra few days to make their decisions and things like that. We could use this space to ask the agency to offer voluntary layoffs and early retirement incentives as a way to mitigate how many people they have to forcibly lay off, to try to do that first. And then Article 29, sometimes that's known as salary savings leave. That gives the employer an opportunity to offer unpaid leaves of absence or like a reduction in hours to employees as a way to try to save money so they're not forcibly laying a bunch of people off. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Maureen because she is right in the middle of a lot of this stuff, especially as it relates to voluntary layoffs and early retirement incentives. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on, Maureen?
I sure can. So with our vocational rehab folks, it's been I'm not going to lie, it's been pretty challenging. They found out in a public meeting that they were facing a $10.3 million shortfall staffing and an overall shortfall in their budget of about 25 million, give or take. That number seems to be a moving target, so I'm just going to say approximately. And so, of course, when we found this out, we met with them a few days later to talk about this. And they were like, okay, there are lots of things. And they went through most of these things that they could do as potential ways to mitigate this. And they also were going to look at cutting services and, getting rid of their fleet cars. And, they'd already like closed off any of their open positions and had a hiring freeze to offset like what their labor costs are considered and things like that. But we then said, okay, well, when will you know? And they said they'd get back to us after they had an all staff meeting where they would discuss it further. Well, they went to an all staff meeting and they discussed it further with them, but they didn't really get into the options more other than to say, it's not going to be that bad. They have underrepresented this at every turn to their members. So it's been really kind of difficult. We've had to be the ones to be like, no, when they talk to us, it really does sound like it's going to be more significant than just a few of you. And right now we have been waiting. They promised us two MOUs, one for an earned early retirement incentive and one for voluntary layoff. And we went back and forth on these provisions quite a bit. But ultimately, the voluntary layoff doesn't really offer anyone anything other than layoff provisions. So there's no extra incentive to do this. I don't know what would incentivize somebody to take this other than they'd already found another job and were leaving and wanted to take their severance with them, or some other scenario in which they wanted to get out of here sooner and take their severance with them, because you know, if they're on the layoff list, they're going to be laid off and have the exact same things, just to make that part of it clear. So we went back and forth on that, and they said that people could collect unemployment insurance, which isn't necessarily true. So we've, had to go out and make them clarify that. Um, and then with the voluntary layoff, they were kind of iffy on, I mean, with the early retirement incentive, they've been pretty iffy on who exactly was gonna, but we got what we have it down to now, and we're waiting to see in the finalized language for the MOU is it's going to be offered to people 55 or older who are vested in their retirement. And then they'll get an extra $1,000 a year of service, up to $30,000 to accept it. Why they're having such a difficulty, we still don't have the finalized language, and we've been reaching out to them every single day, sometimes multiple times in a day, trying to get some of that information. I don't know, but hopefully your response, your experience with that piece of it will be better. But things to watch out for, them making promises that they can't keep. Which situations are going to allow for a continuation of health insurance? Because in layoff, you generally do get an additional 6 months, but not with the early retirement incentive, because they're taking all that money and putting it into your health savings account. Other things to watch for with the layoff, you get a cash payout of your um, voluntary layoff, and and you would get it all into your HSA if you retired. So with the voluntary layoff, you're sick and vacation up to 260 hours of vacation, and the severance language per the contract for your sick, which would be the 40% of your first 900 hours, and then 12.5% after that, would then be be taken. Um, would and given to you in like a check or paid out rather than just stuck into your health savings account. They say cash, but I know they aren't just handing out actual cash to folks. So that being said, Lydia, it looks like you had a question. Let me see if I can read through that. Oh, why wouldn't they be eligible for unemployment? Because they're choosing to be laid off. And if they say that they're choosing to leave their job, we would analyze that as a quit and have to determine whether or not that person was eligible. And so I think that they'd probably have a pretty good chance of prevailing upon appeal. But if somebody viewed that as a quit, we might consider that a quit. And we have in the past. Usually they're corporate layoffs where they get an incentive for that early voluntary layoff. And there really is no additional incentive other than, maybe you're helping out your coworkers and taking one for the team. So, they could potentially be, but we can't guarantee that up front. All of those kinds of eligibility decisions are made on a case by case basis. And unfortunately, we had to point that out to the employer Our HR did not seem to be aware of that fact. So, you know,
So to
just be
clarify,
careful when they're making these offers
and
that
it's
you
management who
see.
just, oh, sorry, is
Yeah.
it management who decides on that case by case basis who is eligible?
Well, our unemployment group does, and we have people that
Okay,
are assigned to those kinds of determinations.
thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, you know, sometimes the money that you're given, if it's viewed as severance, that's deductible and that delays when you can collect unemployment. So it can be a tricky thing. So, they have to just be kind of careful with that. But generally speaking, this is an unusual situation, and I think that that's part of the reason they're stuttering with it. I mean, I think the biggest layoff I had before this one was like 8 people, and this is probably going to be, and it could be around 80. I'm hoping it's not that many, but it could be. And I'm thinking if they offset costs correctly, and some people take ERI, it might be closer to 50 because they were supposed to cost, some of these positions that they didn't fill against staffing. But they do have so many budget shortfalls, it's hard to really say, what they're still going to think they have to take out of staffing. And they've kind of left that $10.3 million number in place. So most of you will have a more straightforward, hey, this funding's gone. This has been a long-standing problem in VRS that they just chose to ignore till it got to a crisis point, which is also super frustrating because, we've been talking to them about their budgets since the previous chair was here, you know. So as an example, I'll talk to you about a more typical layoff. I got a notification a couple days ago that they're going to let one person in our broadband division go. So David Harth and I met with our deed management today because it's somebody out in New Ulm, and that's in his region. And so we talked about it, and basically, the job changed. They had to implement new software, do federal regulations, and this person had a really specialized skill set in mapping that when the software changed, they weren't using the form of mapping anymore. So they didn't need somebody with that person's GIS expertise. So in their case, that person's job just got eliminated because they didn't need that expertise anymore. Anybody could use the software for mapping that they're using now. And that'll happen when, you're looking at budget downturns and tight budgets, that they're going to look at where they can eliminate staff. And so in this case, it was this one person. So, we met with them to talk about it. That person's going to get a layoff notice next week. They're not offering, I mean, they've only been with us a little over a year, so they don't really have they don't have anybody to bump. And they don't have a lot of other, options that way. They hadn't held another job with the state before they came here to like bump down to or anything like that. But we talked about all those things to make sure. So those are the kinds of questions you want to be asking. And you want to ask, and we'll have to be doing this with like, 80 people in VRS. So it's going to be, and we're statewide, so it's going to be all over the place. But like with this person, it's like, okay, do they have any jobs they could claim? And they're like, we're still analyzing that and finding if there's anything that this person would be position qualified to do, and and go from there. But nothing within their current department, which is why they're being laid off. So, that is a more typical, type of conversation that you have, but you still want to make sure that this person's rights are being protected, that they're not, out of order on the seniority list or anything like that, that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we should be copied on all the layoff letters when they come out. So, make sure that you're getting copied on any layoff letters as they come out. So, I mean, we're still mid-process on this. I don't think that most of the layoffs that we might be facing going forward will be as messy as what we're dealing with in voc rehab, because they really tried to hide it from their members. And to find out a public meeting really set that pace differently than it would if, it's like, oh, we're looking to have to lay off 10 people in pollution control, and we're going to meet with you, Katie, to talk about it. That is a completely, you know, different set of circumstances. So I'm hoping that this particular set of circumstances doesn't happen to anyone else. But even if the one where, hey, we're going to lay off 10 people in pollution control, we want to talk to you about it, that's still pretty concerning. And you still have to, make sure you go through it and that they're laying off the right 10 people. And, if they're going to offer anything, that you get those MOUs negotiated to do that. So that's where we're at. Does anybody have any questions for me? Any things that they're concerned about?
I think it was more just to like understand the process better since most of us haven't gone through it.
Mhm. Do you feel like you have a better understanding of the process? Is there anything that we can explain better?
I mean, I think the only part that still seems ambiguous to me is like exactly how some of the seniority and bumping might work, but I also understand that you might not be able to figure that out until like you're looking at a specific example, like the actual stuff.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I can use my voc rehab group as somewhat of an example, though, because they're kind of unusual in that they move up through the ranks within that. So, we do have people that are position qualified in multiple things in that department. So that's going to probably affect the structure of how they notify people and who they tell, because they also are required to notify anybody that might be bumped out of their position at the same time, that,
Mhm.
their job might be in danger due to bumping within the 35 miles or that sort of thing. So, it's potential that like a career counselor could um, bump a rehab rep if they wanted to bump down. Um, it's within your own bargaining unit first, but if you're position qualified and have position seniority in a lower bargaining unit, you can also bump there. So, we do have potential for people from MMA bumping our staff, and we do have potential for our staff bumping AFSCME staff. And that could, in reality, happen as well. It's got to be within the 35 miles, but I mean, when you look at the metro area, that's a lot of ground to cover. And, we also have clusters of like office assignments out in greater Minnesota where, folks could affect one another. There's also a few jobs in our state services for the blind department, which is another division within Indeed, where some of our voc rehab counselors might be qualified for those jobs and may be able to claim those once they are on layoff notice. So, when you talk about like bumping, it's, do you have the skills to do the job that you're bumping? And do you have more seniority than the person that you're bumping? But then there's also claiming of open jobs and open positions and things like that that have to be looked at. And the employer is required to look at with you, but they might not always be all that great at it, I've discovered. So,
And I will, if we have time, I will go through all that stuff too, if folks want. But I just want to make sure we spend most of the time on this section.
Mhm.
yeah.
Maureen, as you're going
Yeah.
through, thank you so much for just taking the time to walk through your situation. It's helpful to hear. It's scary to hear, but it's good for us to have this information. Um, as you're working through this with members, are you bumping seems to be really confusing to a lot of people. It's confusing to me. Are you getting a lot of questions about that and taking the time to walk through folks on that process, or, you know,
We are, but we're also
what's your
anticipating.
strategy for that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've just explained, the rules,
Yeah.
just, like at a high level, because right now we don't know who's going to be able to bump who, you know. So we'll know that when we get the layoff notices, and we're expecting those on March 31st.
Okay.
So, anybody that's going to be involuntarily laid off. So, at that point, then we'll know like who's able to bump whom. But, generally, people do have had some anxiety around this. So we have explained, the ability to potentially bump somebody out of their position if you're more senior than they are,
Okay.
whether it's a job that you've done in the past or the job that you're currently doing, if they're, if you're position qualified to also do their job, if, those positions translate.
Is
So,
that how MMA can bump someone from MAPE if they've been in a MAPE position before? Is that how that, and MAPE to
yeah,
AFSCME? Okay.
exactly. And it is supposed to be within your own bargaining unit first. You're
Okay.
supposed to have
Yeah.
exhausted the options there first, but yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Shanna, oh no, Kristen, I think your hand was up first. Go ahead.
Thank you. So my question is weird, but I don't think I've ever heard it asked before. So say there's someone layoff notices go out, someone's like, I'm taking one for the team, I'm gonna work half a schedule, or I'm gonna just totally be laid off for a while. How do they get back in? Or are they, I mean, are they like a new employee? I mean, like what makes it be
Oh,
not a forever thing?
no, that's actually not a bad question at all, because everybody goes on a layoff list. And you could be on the list for anywhere from 1 to 4 years, depending on your length of time with the department. So if you're on the layoff list, who gets to come back if they start rehiring into that position is based on your seniority on that layoff list. And so like the top person on the layoff list would be the first one to come back.
Wow. So that taking one for the team might be a 4 year a 4 year gift.
Well, they're on the layoff list, but unemployment's only 6 months, right? And maybe they'll find another job that they can claim because, there are open jobs around the state that they might meet the qualifications for that they would get first crack at,
Mm.
you know, but it's still,
In this culture,
I
in
would
this
really
environment.
advise people not to do I can't tell people what to do with their lives, but there's really not an incentive to do the voluntary layoff unless you wanted to leave anyway.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That makes sense. I like my coworkers, but you
Yeah.
know. Oh,
Yeah, I
thank
mean, if you like, let's say you were already looking and had something lined up, that makes sense. Or maybe you were going to move out of state. That makes sense to me. You want that severance to take with you.
yeah.
Totally makes
I'm
sense
too
to me.
old and too close to retirement.
But yeah, and in your case, maybe the ERI would be attractive if they're
Right,
offering
right.
it, you
Okay,
know.
cool.
So,
Thank you.
and then Shanna, you had a question?
Um, a quick question about like challenging a bump that can happen, correct?
Sure. So,
Yeah.
like you're saying that that person maybe isn't more senior than you?
Mm-hmm. Or
Yeah.
you don't think they can't do the job, like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a little harder because management's going to make that call.
mm-hmm,
But sometimes, they do have errors on the seniority roster, which is why we've been telling everybody to check out their seniority roster. And if
mm-hmm.
they find errors, to save that email that says that HR is fixing it because they only publish them twice a year. Cynthia.
Okay, sorry, too many buttons to click. Dumb question probably, but how does the 35-mile radius play into regional offices or telework environment?
Well, if you're in a telework environment, it would be the office that you're assigned to. So 35-mile radius from there and other offices that would be there. So if you're in greater Minnesota, that might mean not no offices, right? But there might be other offices out there, especially let's take something pretty general like, oh, I don't know, grants coordinator, right? Where other agencies have them, and there might not be anything in your agency, but you might be in a position to, you know, claim a job in another agency. I don't believe you can bump somebody. Can you in another agency? Because
No, not
everybody's
across
their own
agencies.
seniority unit, and that would be a different seniority unit. But they might have open jobs that you would have first crack at. Um, but you might have somebody within your own agency within 35 miles whose job you can do, depending on the type of work that you do. Generally, if it's the exact same job, you shouldn't be bumping anybody because if you're above them on the seniority list, they should be getting laid off before you, you know, if they're in the same region as you. But, you know, so it would be, other work usually that's similar and not being eliminated. But I have many divisions at Deed, for instance. So I could see somebody in one division bumping somebody in another division because they do the same work just for a different division. Does that help? I hope. Or did I make it worse?
It helped. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
So there are a couple other things I want to talk about that on this, like options for us. So like EAPs on here. So we know EAP would be available for employees who are being laid off, but something that we could use the MOU negotiation process for is to increase the availability of the length of time somebody is able to contact EAP. We can look at access to job placement services. That's something that I've seen offered before, or like the resume writing workshops. There's things like that. So we can get pretty creative here on things that
Dislocated
we
worker
think would help
program.
others. But yeah, dislocated worker program. Yep. And
Have
that comes
them
up.
come in and help people.
Yep.
Another thing with like the ERI, we're planning to have them be able to meet with the counselors on work time. Because they're going to have to make that quick decision. And so they're going to allow them, they set up appointments and held some position appointments for them so that when people get their letters, they can go straight to them and, get that worked out. And yes, much of this will be worked out in an MOU, but some of it is just what they're agreeing to too, like, hey, we're going to let these people come in and, they might not put the, dislocated worker services right in the MOU, but if they're bringing them in and saying you can attend during work hours, that's one of the things that they're agreeing to do. But the main points definitely should be in the MOU.
Yeah.
Which is why we've had to go back and forth on ours, because they've left things out.
And keep plugging along.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Okay,
and
sounds
then,
good.
We can, if you guys think of stuff, just maybe put a pin in it and we'll grab it at the end.
Okay,
sound good?
Sounds good. A couple other things I want to mention on this slide before we move on. So on the other methods of mitigating layoffs or their effects on employees, I want to talk a little bit about, so the only other time I've seen this, which was when the Department of Revenue closed a bunch of their regional satellite offices in greater Minnesota. We entered into MOU negotiations to waive the job posting requirements, because currently the contract states if the employer reassigns a job for more than 35 miles from their current location, it has to get reposted, and that would result in layoffs. So in this situation, they were reassigning everybody to the central office more than 35 miles, but putting them on telework agreements. So we entered into negotiations to waive that provision in the contract, which saved a couple of hundred people from getting laid off. Now, I also want to mention that was very messy. And it took, in order to make those people completely whole, it was like a 3-year organizing process, which could be a whole nother meeting. And I'd want Ann there and things like that. But the reason why that's important to bring up is the pitfall. And I just want to sort of level set with folks to understand sort of the weak part that we have in negotiating MOU around layoffs is that the union doesn't necessarily hold the strongest hand, in that the employer can always lay people off. So that's what we ran up against with revenue MOU negotiations, is that we would propose this really powerful MOU proposal that would be great for the employees. And then revenue would just say, no, we're not going to accept it. The alternative is to lay them off. And of course, we didn't want to do that. So that kind of hurt our leverage. Of course, we organize and things like that, but organizing takes time. It's not always an immediate thing. So that's just, I always want to kind of level set with folks that is one of the things that we're sort of running up against, is that the employer, even though we have the right to negotiate MOUs, the employer does have a right to still lay people off. So they kind of hold some leverage on that. I just want to be honest about that. I just want to pause for again a couple questions. Are there any other options that people have seen that would mitigate layoffs, or that you think could, things are not listed in these bullet points, but maybe should be?
I mean, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's not truly an option of avoiding a layoff, and it sometimes hurts our agency, but the PCA holds so many vacancies on purpose. So it's a balance of habitually understaffed versus, the threat of layoffs. So I don't know which one's better in the end, but that's their strategy, it seems to be.
Yeah.
And at MDH, we're talking with management about kind of prep stuff. So this wouldn't help when we get to layoffs, but try to avoid layoffs. They're doing a lot more only posting jobs internally so that people who are on unstable funding could move to more stable funding. You wouldn't just get the job automatically because you're on unstable funding, but it lowers the pool. And then they also said that they're applying for a waiver from HR so that they don't have to post management positions externally, so that it gives internal candidates an edge on management positions so that they can move up, which we know they will be moving into MMA, but then it opens up more mate positions for people who are out in unstable funding to move into that new. So it kind of creates like a domino effect.
Yep.
So I think that that's, kind of prep us to maybe have some fewer people who would be on a chopping block if it came to layoffs.
Yeah. That's great, Lydia. Thanks for sharing that. That's a really good idea. I think I'm going to share that with the other BAs as well.
Yeah. It's hard to compel them to do anything they don't want to do, because they just could say, well, we'll just lay them off. And it even feels a little bit like, in my case, my agency's trying to run out the clock, because they have to have these layoffs done by a certain amount of time. And that's super frustrating and, not real good treatment of their staff, frankly. But for instance, they had been talking potentially about a voluntary reduction of hours with our group, but they've decided that they're not going to go with that at all, because they just won't have time to implement that before they have to do the layoffs, because of how long it's taken them to implement the ERI, the early retirement options. So,
anything else on this section that's specific to us as Meet and Confer committees?
I'm just thinking, if you think of anything, like sometimes you'll have a really creative idea about your specific agency that would save them money. Doesn't hurt to propose that.
And if you all want me to, I can keep plugging along on this PowerPoint. If it kind of gets into more of like the layoff process and like a lot of the questions that folks had from Maureen, it kind of touches on those.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Keep going and then, yeah. Okay. All right, sounds good. And then if anything pops up that you can think of that's super relevant, to this group or whatever, feel free to speak up. Okay, so these next few sections are basically it's the layoff and bumping process. So this is assuming that management has already made their decisions to lay folks off, and this is the process that employees who are in these impacted positions will go through.
Letters are in hand, basically.
Yes. So one of the really important points on this slide here to take away here is, if a vacancy in the same seniority unit, same classification, and the same employment condition exists, the employee has to take that vacancy. So even if it's in a division they don't like, even if it's with a manager they don't like, they have to accept it. A person cannot bump a least senior person if a vacancy exists. So anything we talk about after this is assuming that the vacancies are all filled. There's no vacancy, basically.
Yeah. Or in our case, eliminated.
Yeah. So if there's not a vacant position in the same classification and same seniority unit, then these other options take effect, which could include bumping the least senior employee. And these next two things are options the employee could choose from if they're available. So first option would be to bump the least senior employee in the same classification, same seniority unit, and same employment condition within 35 miles. Or if there is a vacancy in the same seniority unit in a previously held classification, then they can also choose that if they'd rather do that. Okay, so this is assuming that no vacancies exist. Then the employee has an option, if they're more senior than somebody, to either bump the least senior employee or to accept a vacancy in a previously held classification, or one in which the employer deems the employee to be qualified for. So if those options don't exist, then the employee can choose. My understanding is that at this point, the employee can choose to be laid off if they do not want to go any further. So any further means basically a demotion in lieu of layoff. And I'll explain that a little bit here. So employees can choose layoffs at this point. And my understanding, Maureen, is that they would get unemployment insurance if they choose to be laid off at this point, rather than taking
right, because they have that letter in hand.
Yes. Yep. So it is the other important point. It is also at this point that they can request, just a request, but they can request to be transferred to a vacancy in another different seniority unit in the same classification, or in a classification in which the employer deems the employee to be qualified for. So that's just a request. Okay. So if an employee gets to this stage, here's another option. So if an employee gets to this stage in the process, These are all potential options. So this is not like a domino, like if option one doesn't exist, then you got to choose option two, blah, 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 blah. At this stage, an employee can choose any of these options. And these are basically an easy way to think about it is these are all like sort of demotions, like demotion options. So option number one is they can bump the least senior employee in a lower or equal classification in which the employee previously served. They can accept a vacancy in a lower classification or a classification in which the employee previously served or is deemed qualified for. They can bump a temporary employment a position as long as there is more than 30 days left on the temporary appointment. A full-time classified employee can bump a less senior part-time classified employee, and vice versa. A more senior part-time employee can bump a full-time less senior employee in the same classification. And all of these options are within 35 miles. But these all make sense as much as they can. Okay. Then if none of those options exist, we continue down the sort of the structure. And if none of those options exist, the employees, when the employee elects not to bump, the employee can either choose layoff again, or they can choose a position more than 35 miles. So this is like the question about like regional offices and things like that. And more than 35 miles, that's where this would come in. So they can accept a vacancy in the same, equal, or lower classification which the employee previously served in the same seniority unit in a position that's more than 35 miles. Or they can bump the least senior employee in the same, equal, or lower classification that the employee previously served, more than 35 miles. Do all those options make sense enough to go forward? Okay. So that concludes the layoff options. Unfortunately, if none of those options that we've talked about, those like 7 options or whatever exist, then they have to accept layoff. So now I want to talk a little bit about, this came up a little bit when the questions from Maureen, but recall lists. So seniority unit layoff, sometimes they're called layoff lists, but basically this is the recall list that an employee is on to be recalled to a vacant position over time if they get laid off. So an important point here is that employees who are laid off or took a demotion in lieu of layoff will automatically be placed on the layoff list for positions in the same employment condition, same classification, and same geographic location, automatically on that list. However, if the employee is willing to accept other geographic locations or other classifications, they can let the agency know in writing that they'd be willing to accept other classifications or other geographic areas. But it's on the employee to let the employer know that they're willing to accept other areas or other classifications. And then there are department layoff lists. Yeah. Oh, Kristen, yes.
Just a quick question. So what
Yeah.
you just said, does that apply for group 3? Say I'm a grant writer, just basic grant writer, and I work for pollution control in St. Paul, and I'm like, you know what? I think I want to move to DL. Can I accept a job there, or do I have to stay within 35 miles since I live here in the cities?
So in your example, is that a demotion? You took a demotion under group 3?
Oh, is group 3 just emotions? I was just focusing on the outside of 35 miles.
Oh, and I'm sorry. No, you're right. Accept a vacancy in the same. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Okay.
I don't believe so, to be honest with you. I think it's only for employees who are laid off or took a demotion in lieu of layoff.
Okay.
But that's a really good question.
I believe they can request a transfer, but they don't have a right
Yeah.
to do a transfer.
Right. It's not automatic.
Okay. All right. Good to know. And I don't work for pollution control, so and I'm not a grant writer. You're all safe.
Okay, the next department. So department layoff lists, these are for people who work in departments that have multiple seniority units. So this only applies to people in DOC, Minnesota State, and DHS. So an employee in these agencies can request to be placed on a department-wide layoff list, and they have to put in writing which seniority units they would accept. And again, the employee has to be proactive and request this. So for example, if somebody's getting laid off from Lino Lakes Prison, they could indicate that they'd be willing to work in the Shakopee prison or the Faribault prison, but they have to be proactive and indicate that. Same with, folks in the colleges, they can indicate which other campuses they'd be willing to accept. Beth, I don't think. Oh, does MDVA have multiple seniority units? We can look at page 101 quick.
I think each home is a
Yeah.
seniority unit. So yes.
Yes.
Well, if that's the case, then yeah.
Okay.
But I need to adjust the PowerPoint on that. I didn't realize that MDVA had multiple seniority units.
They didn't used to.
Oh. But
They
yeah,
opened
thanks for
those new
pointing that out.
homes not that long ago. Yeah.
Oh, yep, I see them. Yep, definitely. That's, yeah, okay. I'll adjust the PowerPoint on that. Yeah, that's good flag. Thank you, Beth. So MDVA has multiple seniority units. And then there's another couple lists that folks can be on, and these are other agencies that MAPE represents. So upon request, the employee can be on a bargaining unit wide layoff list for positions in the same classification or other classifications, but they would need to indicate in writing which agencies they would accept, which classifications they would accept, which geographic locations they would accept, which employment conditions they would accept, that sort of thing. So again, this is these are not guarantees. This is just a request, and they have to put it in writing. And that in this part, the bargaining unit wide one goes to MMB, not the agency. The request does. Folks who are on the recall list will remain on there for a minimum of 1 year and a maximum of 4 years, depending on years of service. So it's equal to years of service with a min of 1 and a max of 4. Everybody good on the layoff lists, recall lists stuff? Okay. There's a couple other areas in the contract which interact with Article 17, which I just want to talk about. So this clause is actually in Article 17. But so basically what this says, if somebody claims a position in a vacant position in another agency, but they cannot be appointed right now, like the other agency just isn't ready for them to have that job yet, they can either be placed on unpaid leave or utilize 14 days of vacation in order to make up that gap. If they're claiming a different agency and the other agent and they can't start right away, they can use up to 14 days for vacation or take on unpaid leave. Article 13 severance speaks to that if somebody's being laid off, they are eligible for severance, which is a portion of accrued sick leave, and that's paid out in cash. Article 14 has a paid leave of absence, which is discretionary to the employer, but that's transition upon layoff, which is the employer can provide somebody with 80 hours of paid leave prior to being laid off. But again, this is a discretionary leave to the employer if they want to be cool and help somebody with filling the gap or whatever of employment. Vacancies, Article 16 vacancies speaks to the probationary period. So basically what this states that if an employee is placed on a layoff prior to completing probation and then they get recalled, they'll have to complete the remaining probationary period when they get recalled. Right? That's pretty, seems pretty obvious to me. This is a really big one as far as benefits go. So Article 20 insurance, employees with 3 years or more of state service will receive 6 months of employer contribution for health insurance, but it's only for employees with three or more years of service. All right, a couple other things I just want to mention, and a couple of these are very much, oh yeah, Lydia.
Yeah, sorry, I think you kind of addressed it, but I didn't fully catch it in the last one. If someone is on like a parental leave or a medical leave and then their position is laid off, do they get to finish their leave or not?
That is a good question. And I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to, if you want to email me or you're in health, maybe email Beth and I and we can look into it.
Yeah, sounds
Okay.
good. We have
Okay.
just a lot of people having babies right now at health, so it's very top of mind to me.
Yeah, I mean they wouldn't lose out. I just don't know what happened if they couldn't come back by the decision day. That's what I'm racking in my mind. So because they'd be on a leave of absence, they would still have the rights to Article 17. But I just don't know, like if they're medically not able to get back to work and like make these decisions. I just don't know how that works. So I don't want to give
or like
bad
if you're
information.
locked out of your email account, which I think does sometimes happen, like do you even know that you're getting laid off?
Yeah. Let's do some research on that and get back to you.
That's a good question.
Yeah, very good question.
Yeah, the rights are there, but how will they implement it?
Right. That's what I'm wondering. Yeah.
In 2011, I got a layoff notice when I worked for the AG's office, and they mailed it to me. So
Did they? Okay.
Yeah.
I know there's certain things that happen when an employee's on medical leave of absence that they have to contact the employee's personal contact information. So they do maintain that for these types of instances. So I know that's fairly common for when people are on medical leaves. A couple other resources. We talked about this a little bit. UI, unemployment insurance, is available. Any questions? Maureen is definitely an expert on that one. All right, thanks, Matt. EAP would be, of course, available to help navigate, the emotional and mental aspect of going through layoffs, which are definitely real. Dislocated worker. So, and feel free to jump in, Maureen, but my understanding of the dislocated worker program is if like there's a complete changeover in the economy, like from manufacturing to service, that they can implement dislocated worker program. A quick personal story: when I was working at the Ford plant in St. Paul, Highland Park, that got shut down when they announced that the dislocated worker program came in, and they gave us like money for books to go to school and like bus passes to get to school, and there was things like that. But my understanding is that it got triggered because of like some kind of major economic impact. Is that right, Maureen? Is that how
Yes,
dislocated
well,
worker?
that's a yes and a no,
Okay.
actually. You were probably on what they call a group grant because there were so many
Okay.
of you. And so they followed the mass layoff procedure, which does, they do a survey and then they figure out what's needed for that group of individuals that are all affected together. But if you've lost your job through no fault of your own, you are eligible to apply for the dislocated worker program. So there could
Okay.
be just one of you, but then you'd be doing it as a one-off service, probably with one of our multiple dislocated worker providers around the state, and handing it that way. So like for instance, my poor soul in broadband that just found out today that they are going to get a layoff notice next week, they'll be eligible for the program. They just wouldn't be going through as like a group grant. And sometimes there's more available when you go through a group grant because all that money is just for your group. And so they'll decide how much they're going to allocate to that grant. And then, they can do that spending for that group. So when it's a bigger group, a lot of times it benefits them to stick together, go through the grant together and, get the funding for school or whatever it's going to be together. But anybody can get like free resume writing without even being in a dislocated worker program through our career force partners as well. So, there are quite a few services available from Deed, to, go through layoffs with. And I highly encourage that you refer people to those services if you have anybody going through those layoffs.
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. The MAPE website has a layoff toolkit on there. A lot of good information there. Thanks, Kristen. Feel free to check out the website for that. I think you can just search layoff toolkit and it'll pop up. There's a flow chart in the back of the contract regarding layoffs that is much easier to understand than the actual Article 17 language. So keep
It's
an eye
visual.
on that.
It's nice.
Yep. And then, of course, you can always work with definitely work with your BA on the meet confer process, the MOU negotiations, all that stuff. Work very closely with your business agent on that. And of course, RSDs and directors are also available, and stewards. Any questions? All right, took us right to the end here.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate the dedication that this shows to your members. And, it's really uncertain times out there. And feel free anytime to reach out. I have a ridiculous amount of experience with this now, but, I'd also been through some smaller layoffs before this. So, or one time where we mitigated in a group of 10 people by an MOU and things like that. So, I mean, there are things that can be done. And we have various people on this very group that have had to do some mitigation themselves, like Anne over in revenue. So. But thanks for
All right,
coming.
thanks everyone.
I think we'll call it a meeting. And Nick, do you mind asking Cynthia to post it under like the Meet Confer Chairs Committee, maybe?
Oh yeah. What I gotta do? Stop recording. Yep, I can do that.
All right.
Nice job, Maureen.